All right, just an interesting thought to give you an illustration of how language can sometimes, or how translations can sometimes lock us into only one interpretive option, when in practice there may be additional interpretive options. This is the famous teaching of Jesus about divorce, marriage and divorce in Matthew 19. He's given his whole, they've asked him the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? He answers by affirming the divine intention behind the institution of marriage, referring to Genesis 1 and 2, in fact quoting Genesis 1 and 2. And we then come to verse 10, where it says, Legusin auto, hoi mathetai. Notice hoi mathetai, that's another one like prophetes. It's a masculine with a feminine form. So they said to him, the disciples said to him, Ehutos estin heatia tu anthropu metates gunaikos. If this is the case of a man with his wife, u sumfere gamesai. Now, this phrase here is normally translated in your English Bibles as it is better not to marry. Familiar with that? So the disciples said to him, if that's the case of a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. But I want you to notice something here. U is not linked to gamesai, it's linked to sumfere. Sumfere means advantageous. And I'm wondering, I'm going to dig into this, I'm wondering why this is not translated as it is not advantageous to marry, as opposed to it is advantageous not to marry, which seems to imply that the negative would go with gamesai, to marry, but that would require a different form of gamesai, of negative. Okay, I'll come back to that much later in our journey when you've learned the other one. So then the disciples say to him, hode epen autois, he said to them, Upantes chorusin ton logon tuton. Not everyone is able to accept ton logon tuton, this message, but those to whom it is given. Alhois dedotai. Ton logon tuton, this word, refers to what? The default assumption in almost all interpretations and translations is that ton logon tuton refers to the disciples' comment that if this is the case, it's better not to marry. And it has Jesus saying, not everybody can accept this word, that it's better not to marry. In other words, has Jesus affirming almost that, yeah, it's preferable not to marry, but not everybody can accept that. However, just an option. This is not answered by the Greek text, but just an option that we lose in translation. Ton logon tuton. Logon often means message, the whole message. And it dawned on me when reading this, is there a possibility that ton logon, the ton logon that Jesus is referring to, this word, this message, might that be his teaching about marriage, the lofty ideal, that God created them to be one, to be joined, to be committed for life, etc. Is it possible that what he's saying is not everybody is able to accept the divine teaching about God's purpose and ideal for marriage? In which case he's affirming the value of marriage and simply making the point that it is difficult for many to adhere to the high standard that God requires of husband and wife together. That may be a little bit fast and confusing. And I'm not saying that that's right. It's a question that's at least worth asking. The point I'm trying to make is that we get locked into an interpretation that's implied in English translation, unavoidably, because English has to make certain commitments. But it's possible that there are nuances here that are completely different to the standard translation. That may have gone too fast for you, and I may have explained it poorly. So if I did, I apologize.
Kevin,
just a thought. Yeah.
In English, how would you actually? So assuming that I like the idea of what you're putting forward. So let's assume your idea is right. How would you do that in English? Because you've got the message which he teaches, then they make a statement, and then he says not everyone can accept this message. Now in English, we immediately assume the last statement is this message. But how would you say? Would he have to say my message or the message I said rather than your comment? And
you would, if you if you took that as the intended message and you wanted to convey that Jesus, when he says not everyone can accept this message, is talking about God's intent for marriage, which he has just expounded in verses 3 to 8 or 9, you would have to add something to the translation to point beyond the disciples' statement. So you'd have to translate something like, not everyone can accept my teaching, or this teaching of mine, to make it clear that Jesus would be referring to his own words.
Okay.
Now, I'm not endorsing that or saying that I think it's necessarily the right interpretation. All I want to point out to you this morning is that there is an ambiguity in the Greek text that affords an alternative reading of what Jesus was talking about when he said, not everyone can accept this message or this word. And only by reading it in Greek can you pick that up. So hopefully another interesting little insight into some of the value of this. You know, if the traditional interpretation has Jesus implying that marriage is a bad idea, which was foreign to Jewish thought, which was foreign to the Old Testament, and is endorsed by Paul only if it's done for the sake of devoting oneself to a life of ministry without distraction. So there's certainly a high esteem in Paul for a celibate life for the sake of ministry, undistracted by the daily affairs of life. But the whole Scripture has a positive view of marriage, generally. So for Jesus to be saying, well, not everybody can accept that it's better not to marry, but those who can should, seems to fly in the face of the entire attitude towards the divine institution of marriage that Jesus, just in the preceding verses, upholds so highly. And so at least theologically, there's certainly a case for considering that there may be an alternate reference. Okay, I share that as a devotional thought which I picked up when reading this passage yesterday. I just thought was interesting to share. We are 5 minutes over time. Any closing comments or remarks?
Thanks, Kevin. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.